Hey guys, it's Dina, and over the last 2 years, most of you have come across some pretty horrifying images on your feeds. Footage from Gaza has been hard to avoid and hard to watch as Israel has carried out its genocide against the Palestinian people. Despite that, many legacy news outlets in the West have downplayed both the horror and the intentionality of Israel's assault. So today, I'm really happy to be talking to Dr. Assal Rad, who is a historian and who has spent much of the last 2 years critiquing these news outlets, how they use language to obscure reality, and why they fail to uphold their own standards when it comes to properly covering Israel's actions. Asal, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's funny because I followed you for so long. It's so weird when you talk to someone, even though you followed them. So I feel like I know you, even though I don't. But I appreciate all the work that you do. So I just want to say that.
Likewise, I mean, your tweets, especially during the course of this genocide, have just been like such a breath of fresh air and like, yes, why isn't that the headline?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, Asal, as you know, it's been a pretty abysmal 2 years in this genocide when it comes to the Western media's coverage of it. So, talk to me a little bit about how Western media has depicted Palestine and Israel Palestine, even in the years before October 7th.
Well, really, in terms of the framing and the coverage, it's always been the same. The reason I think the last 2 years have been so much harder to digest and why I think there's more public backlash for the media is because of how obvious, clear, and egregious Israel's war crimes are. So that's, I think, the only reason you're seeing this attention. But in terms of the narrative and the framing, this is always what it's been. The dehumanization of Palestinians and the larger Arab and Muslim world in general. Just think back to contemporary history, think back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That wasn't necessarily Israel-Palestine, but it was part of the same Western narrative, which is rooted in colonialism. You look at Orientalism and the history of, centuries of colonialism that tried to justify the exploitation and occupation of indigenous lands in the region through, these lenses that try to dehumanize and create them as, savages and barbarism and that kind of language. That's precisely the language that we see now playing out. It's just playing out in a backdrop where it's so clear that the barbarism and the savagery is on the side that's actually committing genocide, which is Israel, and the Western aligned side, that I think that's what's creating this sort of shift in public perceptions in the Western world.
Would you say the coverage of the last 2 years is worse than it has been, or about the same, better in any way? I mean, it's hard to even answer that because the level of Israel's war crimes and just like atrocities have transcended anything, right? So how do you measure the coverage to what we're seeing on the ground?
It's hard to measure it like qualitatively. It's not that the coverage is different, it's that the context is different. Whereas there's been this Western narrative that sort of ignored Israel as a settler colony, the fact that it's been occupying not only Palestinian territory, but other territory within the region, Syrian, Lebanese territory for decades, the fact that it's an expansionist state, the fact that Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. So all of these aspects of the Israeli state have not changed over time. They are the same. It's just that people are seeing it more because of the daily footage. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's because of Palestinian journalists on the ground. People have been seeing what Western media doesn't want to tell you. That's what makes it worse. It's the context rather than the narrative or the coverage.
Yeah. So what is it that has enabled Western media to have such a deeply entrenched pro-Israel bias and get away with lying time and time again?
The point of a journalist, the point of journalism is to tell the truth. But that's not actually how the media is operating in the Western world, certainly not in the United States. It's operating as a propaganda machine. And its intention, its ties to economic incentives, its ties to power, access to power, and by power we mean government officials and corporate interests. All of that combines to make it less so a truth-telling machine and more so a propaganda machine. So it has to support whatever is the status quo, the government policies and the foreign policies, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Whatever is the Israeli position is repeated by American officials, and whatever American and Israeli officials are saying, our media is repeating. It goes unchallenged. Israeli statements are treated as fact. Palestinian statements are constantly cast with doubt. The sort of Hamas-run health ministry, how that gets picked up over time because they want to undermine what the death toll is. They want to undermine the information that is coming out, even though we know that not only are those numbers generally accurate, but they're actually an undercount of what is happening on the ground in reality. So it's happened because it's an entrenched system that's tied to power.
On the topic of manufacturing consent, when you think back to the coverage in Western media of the past 2 years of the genocide, what are some of the most glaring examples of this that stand out to you?
There are certain patterns that, I've observed and that you'll notice in the way that the media coverage has worked. Patterns like erasing Israel's culpability. And how do they do that? First of all, the easiest way is to just erase Israel from the headlines and as much as possible from the story altogether. You don't mention whose airstrike it was, you just say an airstrike in Gaza. You don't mention who is blocking aid, you just say that there's starvation in Gaza. So this kind of passive voice or erasure of Israel's culpability in everything that has happened in Gaza for the last 2 years. That's one major pattern. Another is just the language, the word choice that is applied to, say, Palestinians versus Israelis. You've seen quantitative studies that show words like victim and massacre are almost exclusively used to describe Israelis and never used to describe Palestinians, despite the fact that Palestinians are suffering through a genocide. The word genocide itself, the fact that it is a genocide and that the media avoids using that language and continues trying to frame it as a war between two sides, that completely erases the asymmetry of these two sides. The fact that Israel is an occupying power and the fact that Palestinians have, in Gaza, lived under occupation, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, this consistent decontextualization of the Palestinian cause as if they're separate entities.
Yeah. I mean, language is so important, and these word choices, although small, have such a deep impact. And that's why I think your headlines that you're constantly correcting are so valuable, because they're really giving people like a crash course in media literacy. Like, you can truly understand the story from the headline if it was just worded a little bit differently, perhaps an active voice versus passive, name the aggressor, name who the victim is. But time and time again, we see that's not the case. And to your point, it's deliberate, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we know it's deliberate, because the patterns are so ubiquitous that there's no way this is happening by accident. There are headlines that don't even sound like English. They're so poorly written because they want to obscure the reality of what is going on because it sounds bad for Israel. I have to read it again. I have to read the headline 2 or 3 times before I even understand what they're talking about. That's a poorly written headline. There's also the fact that they're telling you. I mean, we have evidence from the New York Times leaked memo where they're instructing their journalists the words not to use. What words would those be? Ethnic cleansing, genocide, Palestine, refugee camp. All of the words that would describe accurately what is happening on the ground, those are the words they're being instructed not to use. So it's not an accident. It's very, very clear that at the top of these institutions, decisions are being made on the editorial level to frame and curate a story, not tell the truth of what is happening.
Yeah. And on the topic of New York Times, I was asking you about glaring examples. And what stands out to me is one of the articles is the widely discredited Screams Without Words. Can you talk to me a little bit about this article and what it demonstrated to you in terms of how it was able to be published and then the fallout from it?
Well, there's a few things that are important about it. Number one is, and this relates to the initial coverage after October 7th, right? This atrocity propaganda that is meant to be so horrific. And I'm thinking of the 40 beheaded baby story, right? The debunked story that still gets cited, that people still say, even though it's been completely debunked. What happens is the media, because they take any Israeli source, and they run with it, and they just repeat it over and over again.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
And this becomes embedded in the public mind. Now, the New York Times article, that sort of atrocity propaganda was about sexual violence. It's terribly sourced and it's been debunked, and yet they don't take it down. They don't retract it. And what's interesting is when, for instance, the UN has a report that says that Israel uses widespread sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians, that gets almost no coverage. Even though it's a UN report, it's substantiated. But that gets almost no coverage. Instead, you have unsourced materials or poorly sourced materials that are out there, debunked, and still part of the canon of the story.
We also see this frequent deference to Israel and like attribution of whatever an Israeli source says or an Israeli official says as if it's factual or a reliable source, even though we know that, Israeli officials have lied time and time again, and that's been proven. What do you make of this framing and this automatic deference to whatever Israel says?
Israel says is not journalism. That's just telling me what a state committing genocide that is repeatedly, you said they repeatedly lie. Yes, they've been caught lying repeatedly over and over and over again. And again, that's nothing new. Go back to the Great March of Return in 2018 and the fact that Israeli officials edited videos to mislead about a young Palestinian nurse that was killed because she was shot by Israeli forces. Think back to earlier this year, spring of this year, 15 Palestinian medics that were slaughtered, even though they were in clearly marked ambulances with their lights on, and now there's video footage, so we know that this is a fact. Israel lied about that. First of all, tried to deny that they had anything to do with it. Then once it became clear that they had buried the medics that they had killed in mass graves, crushed their vehicles and buried them with them. I mean, this is an egregious war crime. They lied and said that they were suspicious, that their lights weren't on. Even after there's video evidence, what does the new spin become? Video casts doubt on Israel's narrative. This is how they describe it, because they can't just blatantly say, well, actually, Israel has lied repeatedly, and yet we still lead with Israel says. What it eventually becomes is Israel admits operational failures.
The Israeli military has changed its account of the shooting deaths of 15 emergency workers in Gaza last month.
The army says it found professional failures by its troops who opened fire at a convoy of ambulances.
Israel's military has admitted its soldiers made mistakes.
There's no accountability, and there's no accountability for the institutions that tell these lies in order to manufacture consent for what are war crimes that are being committed with U.S. tax dollars and U.S. weapons.
Did you observe any sort of switch in tone when it came to the mass starvation of Palestinians in Gaza? Because I remember there was a moment when the images of starving Palestinians was widespread that it seemed like a lot of media outlets were kind of picking up on the suffering of Palestinians, and it seemed like the threshold for a lot of people was like, oh no, they can't starve. Like they can die by bombings and, be absolutely obliterated by these whatever 2-ton bombs and stuff, and we'll turn a blind eye, but they cannot starve. Did you see that reflected in the coverage as well?
Collateral damage is something that's been ingrained in the Western mind. We think that is a justifiable thing within the framing of a war. I am not in any way justifying the bombing of Gaza, the bombardment and carpet bombing. But the way that they attempt to justify it is, well, that's part of a war. Starvation is different. It is much, much more difficult to justify. And not that they didn't try. Israel tried to justify the starvation of Palestinians many, many times by saying that the aid was being looted by Hamas, which Cindy McCain, who's, I'm assuming, a big fan of Israel, not necessarily a fan of Hamas, but Cindy McCain, who's the head of the World Food Program, said that was not true. So while there was a shift in tone in terms of, I think, the gravity of the situation and the horror of watching people starve and the fact that it was much more difficult to justify it, there still wasn't the appropriate framing of why it was happening, that it was a deliberate starvation. Every headline should have said, this is a man-made famine, a deliberately Israeli engineered famine. And while there was maybe a harsher tone, there still wasn't the accurate language to accompany it.
Yeah, right. Because otherwise, viewers and readers might be left to believe it's like a natural drought or a natural famine, when, to your point, it was very much designed and deliberate on the part of Israel.
That's deliberate as well, because one of the central components of the genocide case against Israel is the policy of starvation. That's one of the central components of it. So if you are admitting that Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians, then you're admitting that they are committing genocide. And that is precisely the kind of language that they try to avoid, because it also implies not only the complicity of the states that these institutions are a part of, but the complicity of the media institutions themselves who have tried to cover up the same genocide.
So since the so-called ceasefire of October 2025, which we've seen Israel continuously violate at this point, Western media has continued to use problematic framing when it comes to reporting on events. What do you make of the coverage post so-called ceasefire?
So-called is accurate, because a ceasefire in which Palestinians are still being starved right now, where you see rainstorms that are destroying the tents the makeshift tents in a lot of cases that Palestinians are living in, because Israel is not allowing shelter aid in. Yet that is not being reported at all. You have this continued occupation of more than half of Gaza. There's still airstrikes. Palestinians are still being killed. So the language of ceasefire is in and of itself indicative of the dehumanization of Palestinians. That Palestinians can be killed and it's still called a ceasefire is because of the level to which they have been dehumanized.
How do you believe these media institutions should be held accountable for their role in being complicit and enabling this genocide?
Well, there's precedent. If you think about like the Nuremberg trials, there's precedent for the role of propaganda and media. There is a level of complicity, in my opinion. And that, I think, is less about the journalists that are working and more about the institutions, right? Who wrote the memo at the New York Times telling them you're not allowed to use these words? Those are the people who are actually culpable, because they're very aware of what's going on and they're deliberately trying to cover up the worst crimes against humanity. So I do believe that it's important, not only institutionally, where there should be people who are dismissed and fired from their posts, they should not be allowed to work in the media anymore, but actual legal implications of complicity.
So finally, I want to ask you, what message do you have for media consumers in terms of how to be discerning in what sources they read or watch or listen to?
It's fair to say that every source is biased in some way. You know, it's always knowing the fact that we all have an inherent bias, and I'm not trying to deny that. But at the same time, there's your inherent bias that's unconscious, and then there's these are words you can't use. That's censorship. That's censorship. Being aware of that and then consuming alternate media. So independent media, looking online at different sources, and also media from different countries. That's another really important thing. It's like you could actually read sources from the countries to see those perspectives as well. So I think just widening our perspectives, if we are actually interested in knowing what's happening, is one of the best ways to understand what's going on. And then as a consumer, holding the media accountable is about what you consume, what you pay for, most importantly. These are for-profit companies. So if you stop subscribing to them, that is what will affect change, I think, in the most real way.
Assal, thank you so much for all your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.